Hello, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here with you. I also know that you're the after lunch bunch. And I probably just have a few minutes to get in some really important ideas. First, though, I want to thank the people who brought me here. And as everybody else who's been up on this podium has recognized, these things, of course, don't just fall into place. They take a lot of planning. So thank you to the folks right here, and in particular to, here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to start naming names because it gets tedious, and also because there are going to be people that I would leave out. I'll just say this. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Emily, because it made me feel really good. And then I'll just move on. I come to this topic after a long history trying to think about ways in which we can improve systems and to, in a very productive and positive way, interrupt some of the patterns and some of the institutional challenges that are still with us today without making everybody go run for cover. In the early days, I tried to go directly to issues that were highly controversial. And it was hard for the people that I wanted to reach, which is a very large swath of people, to hear some of that. I think discourse, critical discourse, is essential. I think talking about race and racism and all the different kinds of biases are essential. My particular approach that I can offer is to talk about motivation and to talk about motivational integrity. So, of course, as our early morning speaker did, I went to a dictionary and looked up what integrity meant. And many of you, like me, use the word integrity often and may not have a definition right on the top of your head. So this is pretty straightforward. Essentially, it's the practice of doing what it is you say you're going to do. Now, I also looked up the definition of integrity in the Urban Dictionary. Does anybody know what the Urban Dictionary is? The Urban Dictionary people write their own definitions, and then other people who come to the site vote on them. And I was drawn to this one. It's having integrity is not lying. In other words, doing what you said you would do, in caps. Opposite of integrity, telling her you're going to call and then, caps, not calling. That's the definition of a scumbag. So I've been thinking a lot about integrity, and I've been thinking a lot about what it has to do with motivation. And I've come to these three key ideas. This idea that it's teaching in ways that promote goal attainment among all learners, with motivation as an initiator, a mediator, and an outcome of learning. And I think this is really important because motivation is something that many people think of as something that you do at the beginning, or it's a particular exercise that energizes, or there are some of us who still remember when motivation was a matter of receiving rewards or trying to avoid negative sanctions. Motivation is inseparable from learning. Motivation is to learning as heat is to fire. And it's important to think this way if we're really going to get to the point in our instruction where instructional plans can be motivational plans. So the definition of motivation is, the H2O definition is energy directed toward a goal. And In the old days, we used to think that it was something that we did to other people, and in fact, some of that language is still around. I'm going to motivate you. You'll hear people say that. But what happens when we think in that way about motivation is it implies that you're not motivated, that you don't own your motivation, that you're dependent on me for motivation, and it implicitly puts people in a one-down situation. In fact, all people are motivated. All people want to make sense of things that they're curious about. Everybody is motivated, and so when we say things like, my students aren't motivated, what we may mean is my students aren't motivated to learn what I'd like them to learn, right? But they're motivated. And so the challenge for us as educators, and I think there's students in the room as well, but the challenge for all of us as human beings is to try to help people direct their attention and energy towards a goal that they value, that has social value, and that ultimately increases the likelihood that their motivation will continue. So in that way, it's an initiator, a mediator of learning, and it needs to be an outcome of learning. And I'm glad that we don't have ways of testing whether or not motivation is an outcome of learning. That would give us one more great big giant test to administer. But sometimes I feel really badly that there's no way for us to check in on that. In particular, we look at course grades, we look at completion rates and so forth, but we really don't have a mechanism for thinking about whether or not when somebody leaves a learning situation or a course, their motivation is still strong and will continue. Now, motivation is problematic. Motivation in higher education can be problematic because when we're doing things that are the most motivating, sometimes we can feel really alone. Sometimes we can feel that we're calling our own integrity into question, especially if we're trying something new and novel, which is really what it takes, and we haven't succeeded yet. And also because it's not always easy to rally colleagues around an idea that's new. So some of us have felt like this when it comes to integrity. I'm going to hide this so that you don't see where we're going right now. The big issue for me with motivation more than anything else is that when we primarily teach using rewards and sanctions, so for instance, getting a good grade, avoiding a bad one, what people will do is take the most cursory approach to accomplishing a goal. And so whether we intend to or not, we're cheating the cognitive process. And every single one of us has an example of this because most people here have crammed for a test, right? Sometime in your life. And it was to either get a good grade or avoid a bad one. And when you think about what you learned, it's pretty much gone the next couple days. So the challenge is to teach from an intrinsic perspective and in a way that makes us clear-minded about how to reach the broadest possible number of learners. And I am going to show you a pragmatic tool that's been helpful to me and I believe to other people, and that when I introduce it, you can think about your own experience in your own language. But I'm going to introduce it to you as my co-researcher and author Raymond Vlitkowski and I created it, because only when you understand, I think, our own thinking can you scribble on it and make it your own in a way that makes sense. And when you are introduced to a framework or when you read a text, there are different ways to think about it. There's basic decoding, there's the cultural meaning practices, and then there are the pragmatic practices. I'm going to focus today on decoding. How does this framework really work? And then on pragmatic. So how could I apply something like this to my own experience? But first, let's just sort of feel what intrinsic motivation is. And in order to do that, would you think of a time, hopefully you can think of one without too much angst, when you as an instructor, or if you're in the role of learner, felt these three emotions. You felt capable, you felt creative, and you felt vital. I used to say joyful, but a lot of people don't think in terms of hyperbolic language. So let's go with capable, creative, and vital. Go ahead and just turn to somebody and talk about what that might have been. What were you doing? Where were you? What were you learning? Okay, so a time, a situation, an activity, a course, an interaction where you felt capable, creative, and vital. Go for it. You'll have about 4 minutes for this. I'm dry. Thanks. Great. I'm good. I'm good. Okay, just 1 more minute, please. All right, would you refocus, please? Finish your sentence and look up here. Great. Thanks. Is anyone brave enough to volunteer their example? We could just hear from maybe 3 different people. So let's see who the first person will be. Ray, thank you. What is your name?
Hi, I'm Bree Grillo-Hill. I am an assistant professor of biology at San Jose State University. And the example that came forward to me was in my research.
Yeah.
And we got some unexpected results in the lab, and my students and I talked about it and couldn't figure out what to do with it for a few days, and then figured out kind of a new path of research, which is one of the main focuses of my lab now. And so that was the experience that came to mind for me.
Thank you very much. Okay, someone else. You're going to get some exercise, Brian. Okay, thanks, Emily.
Hi, Josh Trout, faculty developer at Chico State. And this is a moment where I can give a little credit to Mr. Anderson, my 7th grade science teacher. I was pretty much a knucklehead kid, poor grades up until this moment where he gave kind of a lecture. This is long before PowerPoint, so there weren't any bullets or anything, but he told a story about what it means to be an organism. And I was just hanging on his every word because it was in a story format. And that was the moment in my life where I was like, I really enjoy learning. This is great. So I owe where I am today to Mr. Anderson.
How great. Have you told him that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, great. Maybe one more, please.
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm a master's student at Sacramento State University. And when you mentioned those terms, I immediately thought about my very first experience with research in my child development quantitative research methods class. And at the end, we had to make a poster and do a symposium-style presentation, and it was very scary, but throughout the course, we interacted with the data so much, and our instructor was constantly keeping us on track and answering questions. And by the end, during my very short 2-minute presentation, I felt completely excited and capable about the research I had done.
How great. Thank you. So we have 3 different kinds of answers. We heard about a research lab, kind of struggling to find your way, but after some scrutiny and heartache, the path became clear. How's that for a paraphrase? All right. We heard about somebody who ended up influencing your life in amazing ways and who was motivating probably as a human being, but whose way of teaching really caught your attention. And then we heard about somebody who is a graduate student doing research, quantitative research, and who took on the challenge, really, of figuring out how you were going to give a stellar 2-minute presentation about something that sounds to me like it was quite complex. Is that reasonable? Okay. Thank you. How many of you couldn't think of a time where you felt capable, creative, and vital this year? Or any time in your life? Some of you, we can talk afterwards. But you know, this is the challenge, is that sometimes it's really hard to think because when we're in the act of feeling that way, we're not really aware of it. So, what my co-researcher and I tried to do is look at a whole bunch of literature and research and lots of different theories and put them together so that we could answer the question, how can we more consistently support motivation, intrinsic motivation to learn within and across cultural groups and all kinds of backgrounds? And this continues to be a bit of a challenge because just in the area of motivation alone, let alone other disciplines that speak to motivation, we have theories all the time that emerge. We've got mindset, right? We've got social emotional is something that many people have become more familiar with. We've got the concept of grit. But we also have these theories like self-determination theory and the importance of agency. And then from the larger domain, we have everything that we know about motivation from universal design, for example, from our assessment folks, from people who think about critical literacy. I mean, you cannot be in education and not have some kind of theory that connects somehow to motivation. So what do? How can you make an instructional plan a motivational plan with this idea that really to have motivational integrity, we need to get better and better at supporting learners in their motivation before, during, and after. So here's what we came to. And as you think about your own examples of when you felt capable, creative, and vital, you might see these conditions in your scenario. So the first, of course, is inclusion. I mean, who's going to be motivated if they don't feel respected and somehow connected to other people? The examples spoke to connections with your educator, your teacher, but also connections with your peers. And in the old days, we thought of this as being the kind of touchy-feely. That was language I never liked. But this has cognitive value, because when you learn, what you're doing is being your most authentic self. You're being vulnerable. When we're truly learning, all we have to do is think of something we've recently tried to learn, to remember the kind of humility that involves. And who's going to put themselves at risk if there's any kind of fear of humiliation or discord or alienation? The second has to do with developing a positive attitude towards learning. And you'll notice that there are two criteria for each of the four conditions. And in the research that we scrutinized, the two things that influence a positive attitude more than anything else are choice or volition and relevance. And choice is always a challenge. It's always choice within a framework, or else you've really got a situation on your hand, right? But, and largely you've got a situation on your hand because when you don't have clear boundaries, the voices that are most likely to emerge and be dominant are not necessarily representative of all the other kinds of voices that are in the room. And so, and relevance, how do you make something relevant? The example of a story speaks to having a positive attitude toward learning. Even before you learned anything deep in the sciences, you had a positive attitude. Now you can attach strategies to each of these, and we do that. So for instance, with inclusion, like many of you, we have lots of different things we do, from participation agreements, which become more and more essential as we do group work, because without them, the people in the group who are most likely to feel disconnected are people who are learning English along with academic content, or people who've not historically seen themselves in higher education. But also with attitude, there are different things you probably do to foster a positive attitude towards learning. This is really where, for me, remembering to ask people to set their own goals in addition to the goals that I want to set is important. Can you think of any other examples that you use right off the bat to foster a positive attitude towards learning and are willing to share? Some of you might do quite a bit with prior knowledge. You know, the old KWL, what do you know, what do you want to know, how will you learn it? There are lots of different strategies, but right now I'm talking conceptually, less technique-ish and more conceptually. Now everybody feels great, they love coming to your class, but they have to learn something, and that's what meaning is. Challenge and engagement, we hear those words a lot. What we're really after here is having people so lost in a learning experience that they can lose their sense of time, they can lose their appetite. It's what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow. Some of you who run know other language that comes from the physical sciences. Flow is this idea of high challenge, low threat. If you've got high challenge, high threat, you've got anxiety. So when we talk about having high expectations and so forth, but we don't have adequate safety nets, that can be problematic. When you think of low challenge, low threat, you've got boredom. So high challenge, low threat. And this is where problem posing comes in, inquiry, integrating the arts, all kinds of things that allow people to completely lose themselves because they're so involved in the learning for the learning itself. And then finally, we've got to have ways for people to see that's my plane going back to Chicago. And I let it go because I'm staying here with this weather. Okay, so now competence. So we know a lot about formative and summative assessment. Some of us think a lot about equitable grading and those kinds of things. Some of us think about self-assessment. The most important thing here is that assessment needs to provide evidence that we're becoming more effective, and not just in what an instructor or a discipline values, but in what we value. So all four conditions work together. When you think about the example that you use for capable, creative, and vital, could you nearly map it onto this? Could you think about the fact that there was something in it that helped you to feel connected and respected? There was something that was relevant and that had choice. There was challenge and engagement. And your assessment practices for seeing what you had learned had built-in authenticity and effectiveness in ways that you valued. That's not a small thing to plan for. But if we're really talking about motivation and motivational integrity, and this idea of making motivation something that happens throughout a learning situation, what we need to do is have some sort of conceptual model for planning, because without it, we'll rely on our default mode. And my default mode is not necessarily, given how I was socialized, the same default mode of the learners who've come to my class or course. Now, the thing about this is some of us are really good at one or two of these, and not so good at another one. All of us have learning edges. Or some of us can apply this on a basic level, but it's harder to go deep. When you look at this particular model, just going with it, with somebody who's nearby, will you talk about which of these four conditions are you particularly strong in? And then think about which of these conditions is really a learning edge for you. And people who are in the room, who are in the position of students right now, or here as students, think just about your own learning situations. Choose a context and think generally across your classes. When you go to classes, are all four of these typically represented, or is there one that's almost always missing? Have that conversation. So that the rest of us, where's your strength? Where's your edge? Go for it. We'll take about 4 minutes here. Okay, may I have your attention, please? So do you know this technique of fist to five? It's asking people if they'll use their hands like it's actually Likert, I believe, but we've learned to say Likert, and so now when I say Likert, I'm afraid that people don't think I know what I'm talking about. But use your hand as a scale, 1 to 5, with 5 is high, 3 is right in the middle, and fist is not at all. To what extent could you make sense of this particular model, just in your conversation? Okay, thank you. Now, the thing about fist to five, if you choose to replicate it in your own work, is you've got to make sure that everybody plays. Otherwise, you're only hearing from the happy people. Although there was a range, because any conceptual model can be explained at a surface level, but then has to be messed with and integrated into one's own way of thinking to be of value. If I could ask students, without putting you too much on the spot, when you think about your experiences campus-wide, is there one motivational condition that tends to be missing, or one that's more prominent than any of the others? Let's do it this way. Oh, thank you for volunteering.
My name's Lauren, and I'm a master's student here currently, working on curriculum and instruction. And being that it's an educational master's, or in that field, it's very different. So I'd have to say, because of that, more of that is happening in my classes, as opposed to, I'm sure if you were getting your master's in a different field, it would look very differently. But in my more traditional type classes, I would have to say that some of the pieces that were missing would be the competence piece, being able to really show the evidence of what I learned, because if I wasn't able to demonstrate it the way that they wanted me to demonstrate it, didn't necessarily mean that I didn't understand the concept. I just wasn't maybe able to demonstrate it the way that that professor wanted me to.
Exactly.
I didn't have that option or choice to show them in a different way or something. So maybe that.
Thank you very much, which takes us back to what Dr. Kelly was talking about this morning with universal design, right? That we have to have some choices in the way people both learn, construct knowledge, and can demonstrate knowledge. You know, the thing about any model is it's a certain point you make arbitrary decisions because, in fact, there's tremendous overlap, isn't there? For instance, relevance is something that you've got to have an assessment in competence, right? However, what I try to do is just make sure that no matter what I'm teaching, I'm hitting on all fours to the best that I can figure out at the moment, and this is where collaboration comes in. And so for me, it means finding a motivational condition that I'd like to start with. Some of you like to start with competence and backwards mapping. Some of you like to start with meaning and a creative idea. But ultimately, you've got to hit on all fours. So for example, you might be an instructor that comes up with great problem-based learning opportunities, but there isn't any real safety for people to collaborate. You might be an instructor who gets everybody excited about learning, positive attitude towards learning, but ultimately, when it comes to testing and grading, you've got winners and losers. So, and those of you who like to plan sequentially, I just would like to say one more time, these planes are reminding me I have to get on one. All right. But plan sequentially, but then code for whether or not you really are hitting on all fours. And I'm going to put this out too. Students are such an important resource for instructional improvement, and yet that's loaded with dilemmas. I'm going to use an example of one way in which professional learning has occurred that could happen on every campus if we were really courageous. And this is called Data in a Day, and this is sort of my last little piece, and then I'm going to close. But Data in a Day was a way of organizing teams of people where you had 4 people on a team and you had 8 teams. And each person on a team had a motivational role. One person was inclusion, one person was attitude, one was meaning, and one was competence. So across teams, you'd have 8 people who were looking for inclusion. Are you following me for the most part? And these 8 teams each visited 4 different classrooms. There was a schedule with the goal of taking a snapshot of teaching and learning across the campus on a particular day. And after they visited these 4 classrooms, and oftentimes they would stay for just a half hour, not the full class, they would come together and we would just do a jigsaw. We'd have, basically a jigsaw. We'd have all the inclusion people in one corner, attitude in another, meaning in another, and competence in another. And they had used rubrics, by the way, so they weren't, all over the map. And they talked about, now here's some hyperbole, but they talked about wows and wonders. So the inclusion people talked about all the kinds of things they saw that were really quite amazing. There's tremendous teaching skill on campuses. I'm always blown away by what I see. And then they talked about wonders, which was instead of saying, this wasn't so good, posing it as, I wonder what might have happened if, or I wonder if there was a way that such and such could occur, or I didn't yet notice, but we worked on the language. And then the faculty whose classrooms we had been in at the end of our gathering came and they did a silent walk around looking at all of the information. All of it was anonymous, but basically it was really powerful for them to see overall how much was happening and how much can improve. And students became real champions of instruction across this university system. In fact, instructors started inviting students to come and listen to a project they're considering, so they'd vet their projects. Over a long haul, Data in a Day was expanded so that families and parents came and learned about teaching and learning and so forth. I'm putting this out there because unless we're really risky, and unless we have some kind of a motivational framework for making the risk a reasonable one, it's going to be very difficult to improve instruction in ways that are significant for the broadest possible range of learners. And here's just one quick thing I'll say. We plan Data in a Day with the motivational framework. We had teams for inclusion that had dinner the night before and got to apply their rubrics. We had for attitude, we worked with the faculty before we did this to ask them what they'd like our purposes to be, how they'd like to have feedback, and so forth. For meaning, the challenge of just going into classrooms and trying to watch deeply, and then for competence, having a way for people to come in and make sense of things. The faculty did a quick write, and even though this was cumulative data, they set personal goals. Those are the kinds of things from a professional development perspective that can help campuses make a really clear case that instruction is what we prioritize here, that we're devoted to supporting the motivation and learning of every single student. And look at what we're willing to do. Now, you don't have to do data in a day. I'm just trying to put out a big idea about the kinds of novel things we can do, even in academia, even with all the work that people already have, and even with all the doubts that will always be a part of teaching, because we can never get it right. It's very difficult to do all four of these things and in a way that has meaning for every single student, but without a conceptual language, how can we improve? This I always say with a sigh. To love something is to find it inexhaustible. I think I'm in the presence of a lot of people who really love teaching, and maybe are even exhausted by it. But I hope I've contributed a couple of ideas about motivation that you'll take with you and mess with and make your own somehow. Thank you so much.